Good morning and Shabbat Shalom and welcome. This is Valley Beth Shalom Torah study for a Shabbos morning. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein, joined this morning by my dear friend and teacher and colleague, Rabbi Marc Gellman from South Florida. And good morning, Rabbi Gellman. And happy Hanukkah, good Shabbos to you. This morning is a triple Shabbat. It is Shabbat Miketz, it is Shabbat Rosh Chodesh, and it is Shabbat Hanukkah. So if you'll be attending services later this morning, you're going to be there for a while. We take out 3 Torahs this morning to commemorate each of these wonderful special days. You know, the Torah cycle and the holiday cycle are not coordinated. I suppose if we were a better organized people, we would have done a better job at this and coordinated the two. So for example, that in the springtime when we will celebrate the Passover, the Torah reading at that time is someplace in the middle of Leviticus. And now Hanukkah comes and we're reading the story of Joseph in the Bible. And even though the stories are not coordinated, there's a tremendous connection between the two. It just begs for a connection, because the story of Joseph is the first diaspora Jew. He's the first Jew who's taken away from his home, away from his place, away from his culture, away from his family, and planted in a foreign place in Egypt. And the question of the nature of his identity in that place, who are you when your family isn't there and nobody knows your real internal name? Who are you when no one speaks your language? Who are you in this strange land, in this strange place? And what's your status there? And what is the nature of the power of your survival in that place? How do you survive? Same question as the Hanukkah story. The Hanukkah takes place in Judea, in Jerusalem, in Israel. But it's a story of Jewish transaction with an outside culture. What is our identity? What is our place in a vast cosmopolitan world in the Hanukkah story of Hellenism? And what is the nature of our strength to maintain a sense of distinction, a sense of identity, a sense of place in a world which offers us a very different vision of who we are? I think, Marc, one of the most wonderful things about Hanukkah, and I know Hanukkah is not your favorite holiday, so forgive me for this one, but the Maccabees celebrated the miracle of their victory against the Hellenists, against Antiochus and the Hellenists in Jerusalem. It was a military victory that they celebrated. 300 so years later, the rabbis come along and they change the story. They take away the military part of it because they'd realized by then, having lost 2 brutal wars, the revolt in 70 and the second revolt in 120, having lost 2 brutal wars, the rabbis come to the conclusion that Jews are not going to survive in this world through military might, through military power. A different kind of power is going to have to attend us. And the best example of this is the Haftorah we're going to read a little while from now, this morning, taken from the book of Zechariah, which is an obscure prophet at the end of the Bible. Yep. And the famous line from that Haftorah, the line
let me say it. Lo b'chayil, lo b'choach, ki im beruchi, not by power and not by might, but by my spirit shall you prevail.
Made famous by Debbie Friedman.
Yes.
Aloud Shalom, made famous by the wonderful song by Debbie. But think about that. The Maccabees celebrated the military victory. And yet the rabbis come along and say, no, that's not where our power lies. Our power lies in something else. Now, when we turn to the Joseph story that we're going to read this morning in the Torah, Parshat Miketz, there's a reflection of that. Joseph, in the pit of the prison of Egypt, as powerless as one can get, is fished up from that prison because he can read Pharaoh's dreams. He can see the pattern of history playing out in front of him. The dream is a metaphor for being able to read the patterns of history and understand how we can navigate those patterns of history and find protection and find meaning in those patterns of history. Being able to put together the strange symbols here, there, in a dream and saying, here's where the world is going, and then offering a policy that will help the Pharaoh and his administration negotiate those patterns of history. That's where the Jew survives in this great cosmopolitan world. It's a completely different idea of Jewish power than the idea that the Maccabees promulgated. And that becomes the connection between, I think, the wonderful connection between the Hanukkah story and the Joseph story that we're reading in the Torah today.
I think that's brilliant and true and on the mark. And the first person who had this idea that sort of blew me away, because, you know, I grew up putting money in my grandma's pushka on the table with the wax paper on it with the little blue JNF pushki to plant trees in Israel. I grew up in a very Zionist home. And so for me, and I was fighting the war in Vietnam, and it was all about power, 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 and having power and manipulating power. All of a sudden, I meet a guy named Michael Selzer, professor of political science at Brooklyn College, who wrote a brilliant guy, who very idiosyncratic, who wrote a book called The Wineskin and the Wizard, in which he lays out in that book exactly the theory that you're now espousing, in which he makes the point that Jewish survival for 2,000 years in the diaspora was the result of Jewish powerlessness, not the result of Jewish power. That as you say precisely and brilliantly, it's the Joseph model of the Henry Kissinger model, the Hofjuden model, the court Jew, the advisor to power. And the theory that Michael proposed was, if you are powerless, politically powerless, you don't present a target for anti-Semites, because what are they going to get if they conquer you? They aren't going to get any land. If you have land, you have to defend it with an army, and you're immediately a target for everyone who wants to conquer you. And that, of course, is the history of Israel, of Canaan, of the promised land in the Tanakh. That's its history. And we even worked together on a journal he started called Fourth Commonwealth Notes, because both of us believed that these commonwealths, the first and then the second, the third, which is the rabbinic, up to the Holocaust, the third commonwealth had ended with the Holocaust, because the Holocaust represents the refutation of the Joseph model. The Holocaust showed us that precisely because we had no political power to defend ourselves, we were a target. Even though we didn't have land, even though we didn't have political power, we had money. And because we had money, the Reich understood, and Hitler understood, that he could arm his entire army for the invasion, first of Austria, then of Poland, by basically building tanks and bombs and planes with money he would steal from Jews. And so we were the target. And 1 out of every 3 Jews who were alive in 1931 had been murdered by 1945. 1 out of every 3 Jews on earth. And that changes things. That changes everything. And that is, to me, to this moment, to this day, in my heart, the great appeal of Zionism, which is to say, the Joseph experiment failed in Auschwitz. And what we need, what we require for our safety, for our continuation in the fourth Commonwealth, post-Auschwitz Commonwealth, is political power again. And you could sort of see that in the development of Jews in America, where at the time of the war, I mean, you had a Jewish treasurer, secretary of the Treasury, and that was it. And a couple of congressmen and a couple of senators. Now, you've got at least 10% of the Congress is Jewish. And you have a lot of, and AIPAC and the funds and the political organizations that we have, we have political power in America. So I think your example is on the mark. And the question then arises, does the Holocaust end the Joseph experiment?
It's a wonderful point. I would just back the date up. I think this was Herzl's point. It didn't take Hitler, it took Herzl, who saw already in 1897 that it's not that the Joseph model failed. It worked. It kept us alive for 1800 years of diaspora. But modernity brought a different kind of anti-Semitism, a different kind of world. And in this world, you can't afford to live without an army, without some material power in the world, some political power in the world. And so you have a switch, if you will. Instead of the model of Joseph, you take the model of Queen Esther. You need to be in the palace, next to power, engaged with power, part of the process of negotiating worldly power. That's the only way the Jews are going to survive. The great question, however, is this question, which I think is something that we anguish over all the time. So Joseph is able to read dreams. He's not the Pharaoh. He's the second to the Pharaoh. He can read dreams. Another book in the Bible which takes up the same challenge is the book of Daniel, which was written pretty much at the time of the Maccabees or just before it. Daniel can read the writing on the wall, literally, when God comes and writes a message on Nebuchadnezzar's wall or Belshazzar's wall, and Daniel can read it. The question is, once we re-engage with real worldly power, do we lose that ability? Do we lose our prophetic sense? Is the prophetic sense a product of our powerlessness? Is it tied to our attended on our powerlessness? Or can we maintain both gifts? Can we have political power in the world, negotiate it properly, govern it properly, not be tempted by it or seduced by it, and at the same time be able to read the patterns of history and understand where history is going and be able to stand on top of the waves of history so that history doesn't drown us? I mean, that's to me, the really interesting question.
Yes, I agree. And if you look at the way that Israel is treated, you can see that your agony is just played out. Every time Israel defends itself, they're criticized in ways that no other army is criticized. And the fact that they liberated in the Six-Day War, they went house to house rather than bombing areas, which would have dramatically lowered the casualty rate of Israeli soldiers. They just to save people, but they're still condemned. If they do one thing, and there's a massacre at Sabra and Shatila and with our allies in the north, and it's all of a sudden the Jews who did this. And so my answer to your question is no, you can't do it. You have to pay your money and take your choice. You have to enter the world of power and do whatever you need to save that power, which means save your country, save your people, because that is your first obligation. And you can see that happening in Israel now, that they have to decide. I mean, morally speaking, it would be great to just say to the Palestinians, look, here's a state and you run it and we'll live side by side. But without an agreement to act in a peaceful way across the border, it would be irresponsible to create a state made up of people who want to murder you. So that's the agony of the debate going on in Israel. In America, the issue is, what does it mean to have Jews who control power, but are they operating in a way that benefits the Jewish community or just their political party? And that's a very difficult question to answer. But my basic instinct is, that Zechariah was right, that it's not by might and not by power, but by my spirit that will you prevail. And our prophetic voice is silenced the minute we have to do what we have to do in order to survive.
I'm going to respectfully disagree with you.
All right.
Not on the facts. The facts, I think, are exactly right. What the only place I disagree with you is this. I think that we have to maintain both and, not either or. And I know that's going to leave us in an agonizing place. It's a lot easier to wield power and set aside your moral scruples with the basic idea, well, this is the way the world is and I have to do it. But that's not Jewish. The agony of being both a prophet and the king, to wield the power, to have to make some very painful decisions about protecting the community, but to do it at the same time with a sense of moral aspiration. At least this much to say, yes, I have to do some things which are very unpalatable morally, but I aspire to a time and a place and a circumstance when I won't have to do that. And I think that moral aspiration always has to be part of our conversations. One of the things I love about Israel, I mean, if you go to Israel, you read that there's a dozen daily newspapers in Israel. For a country of 8 million people, there's an awful lot of newspapers. And the reason is because there's a great deal of criticism. And I think that, the ferocious self-criticism of the Jewish people, our political and moral dialogue over these very issues, that's what makes us us. That's really what distinguishes us. That really is what keeps us alive. Again, I have no pretensions and no presumptions that we live in a safe neighborhood. God put us in the world's worst neighborhood. No question about it. And in order to survive in that neighborhood, you got to do some very difficult, painful things, and the circumstances are very painful. But to lose the moral aspiration and simply say, well, this is just the way the world is, and it doesn't bother me anymore. When it becomes normal, that's when it becomes troubling.
Yeah, I would like to say, I think we agree. Our disagreement is really evaporates. I agree completely with what you say. And in fact, I would add evidence for it in the way Israel administers the army, the Tzahal. They have a concept, which I know you're aware of, called Tohara Neshek. Tohara Neshek is something that all soldiers in the Israeli army are taught. It means the purity of arms. And it's their concept that we are different. We believe that our deadly force should have purity to it, meaning you don't use it unless you have to. You don't direct it against civilians. You do everything you can to preserve our moral values. And although other armies have concepts like Tohara Neshek, no army in the world has it as deep in their heart as Israel does.
Yeah.
However, there is a point here, and that it's a one-word point. And that point is Iran. There is a point now where you could say we can be as moral as we want to be, as conflicted as we are, that we have to sometimes blow up a car that might have a child in it to get to a leader, a terrorist leader, that kind of agony, and it is agony. But what happens when you have a nation dedicated to developing nuclear weapons and where you are convinced, if you are convinced, not everyone is, that as soon as they develop that weapon, they will use it. And when you look at the size of Israel, 2 nuclear bombs, one really on Tel Aviv, but one in Haifa, one in Tel Aviv, one in Jerusalem, there is no Israel. That's the end of Israel. So you can't say, well, we won't strike first, which would be a moral point that we would all like to agree with. But what happens when you can't do that? And the Talmud, which is the very epicenter of powerlessness, has teachings in it like Hashkem baboker lahargacha, hashkem lahargo. Someone rises in the morning to kill you, what should you do? You should get up earlier and kill them. That's from the Talmud. So I love the notion that it's both and I agree with that. But I think we're entering a point because of the high technology of nuclear warfare and other kinds of warfare, cyber warfare, which is a whole different thing, sometimes even more brutal than nuclear weapons. But what do you do when you have an enemy who's insane, just insane, and ready to take their whole country down with them just to destroy Israel? Are you to have agony about a retaliatory strike? Or are you going to say, they're arising in the morning to kill us, we have to get up earlier and kill them?
Yeah, but you still do it with a sense of morality. That's the point.
Yes.
That I think is still the point. Let's take a look inside the story before we conclude today. The story is just it's the best told story in the Torah. It's the most articulated, it's the longest novella, basically. It's an articulated story of Joseph and his journey. So the story begins, of course, Pharaoh has the famous dream. And if you ever saw the Andrew Lloyd Webber Midrash on this, it's a wonderful scene. It's the Elvis Presley song about the cows and the corn. And they go fish out Joseph from the jail, and they clean him up and they present him to Pharaoh. And right away, he can tell Pharaoh what his dream is. And he acknowledges that this isn't his ability. This is an ability granted him by God. And Pharaoh sees him as somebody who can, as a very capable young man, and elevates him to become the second in command of the country. Because not only does he interpret the dream, not only does he tell him what's going on, not only is he able to read history and the events and the trends and the patterns of the history that are really going on around him, he gives Pharaoh the one thing every leader wants most. He gives him a policy option. And that policy option is a fail-proof policy option. 7 years of goodness, 7 years of prosperity, you will tax the people. And then will come 7 years of want, and you'll have plenty there to feed the people. Now think about this for a minute. If he's wrong, what does he lose, right? During the next several years of prosperity, he's built a surplus. What leader is going to complain about having built a budgetary surplus? And then if the prosperity doesn't end, if it keeps going, what leader is ever going to complain that you predicted an economic downturn that didn't happen? It's a completely fail-proof policy. And Pharaoh recognizes this immediately.
Right, and the other side is, if there is a famine, you trade the grain you've stored up for their land.
Right, and that's what he ends up doing.
Yeah, you end up owning everything.
Which is what happens in Egypt, which is how the story ends up, of course, happening. And we get a glimpse for a moment of what happens to Joseph, the radical shift, the complete shift of the pendulum from the boy cast out, forgotten in the pit of Egypt, forgotten in the jail, in the prison, all the way to the top, to sit beside Pharaoh and rule the entire world. And just before the brothers come back and the family story continues, we get a picture of him at his apotheosis, his highest point. He has a chariot, he has an Egyptian name, and he gets Safnat Paneach, and he gets an Egyptian wife. Now, the wonderful thing about that wife, I know you wrote a midrash about this. The wonderful thing is it's Osnat Bat Potiphara. And if you remember, it was Mrs. Potiphar, Mrs. Robinson in the Bible. Here's to you, Mrs. Potiphar, who tried to seduce him. Because the Torah has a sense of brutal irony, of bitter irony, right? You get the beautiful daughter of Mrs. Robinson as your bride, which is also how Neil Simon's story ends. Who is this woman, Marc?
Well, it began. Let's just take this from the beginning, which is really, you keep pushing back the beginning. It starts with Leah, who gave birth to, let me see, Reuben, Shimon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun. And then she's pregnant again. Leah's pregnant again. And she knows that Rachel will be despised if she only has one child. And so she prays that the child in her womb would be a girl, and then Rachel can have Benjamin, but she dies in childbirth with Benjamin, and the child in her womb becomes Dinah, the only daughter amid the 12 boys. And then you have this strange example of the Torah getting its numbers wrong, where at the ford of the Jabbok, Jacob is there, and he says he divides his camp. You talked about that last week. And he sends his wives and his flocks and his 11 children across the river. Well, Gellman noticed, the Darshan noticed, whoops, it ain't 11 children. He's got 12 children. 11 boys, if it said Achadesrei Banim, but it's Yiladim. And that's wrong. And so of course, the rabbi said, whoops, what happened here? And they make up all sorts of fantasy things like, well, Dinah was put in a casket and shipped across the river because he was worried that Esau would want to marry Dinah, and he thought Esau was a pig, and he didn't want Dinah to get married to that pig. And she didn't get counted. And it's really so funny. And anyway, then the story goes on. Dinah gets raped because she goes out without her escorts, just like Sonny in The Godfather. He gets angry and he goes on and he gets shot on the parkway. And Dinah gets raped by Shechem. And the Midrash says, and in Genesis 41:45, we see they had a kid from the rape. And the kid they had was named Asnat. So they can't leave the kid in the camp because it's an example of a rape, and it would embarrass everyone. So what do? They sent her down to Egypt. Now, Potiphar, back to our story, is a eunuch. Means he's not there for his wife, and he's not there for any woman. So when it says the daughter of Potiphar, there is no such thing as the daughter of Potiphar, but he's adopting these people, these children, and he finds, okay, so I'll adopt Asenat as my daughter. Then he gets Joseph under the protection of Ishmael. Remember last week's story, because Ishmael is going down to Egypt to die, and he's bringing Midianite traders on his caravan, and he sees the pit, and he sees Joseph with the coat of many colors, and he knows what's going on in their house because Esau told him, and he was able to keep track, but they didn't know because it was an embarrassment to them. So Asenat is in Egypt, and Joseph, the Jew, finds the only other Jewish person in Egypt, the daughter of his great uncle, whatever that relationship is, to Asenat. He marries Asenat, this woman, and that the thing about it is it changes the entire dynamic of the covenant, because before that covenant, before that story, there was one chosen and one cast out. So you have Isaac chosen, Ishmael cast out. Then you have Jacob chosen and Esau cast out. And then for the first time, and Ishmael sees this in the caravan, the one chosen is the one cast out. Joseph is the one chosen, and he is the one cast out, which enables Ishmael to die in peace, because he now sees the covenant is not brutal. The covenant is not in favor of one child getting preferential treatment and everyone else being cast out. God has learned, God has grown, God has understood. Now I'm going to pick someone who will be cast out, and that is Joseph. And then finally, the chosen people is the people who were cast out of Israel, and they're in Egypt, and then they come back. And so the message of the Torah becomes a new message. Someday you will all be cast out of this land, but you are still chosen. And that is my midrash.
So Osnat, the wife of Joseph, is really the
His
daughter of
grandniece, great niece.
Dinah, who's his aunt,
Right,
right?
right,
His aunt, and it's actually they're cousins. They're first cousins.
right. Because yes, their first
Only other Jew in Egypt. He finds the only other Jew in
only other
Egypt.
Jew in Egypt, because she had an amulet, which is part of also these.
Ooh.
It's from the, I think it's the Baba Batra 122a. There was an amulet that they gave her, and it said Asenat, daughter of Dinah, daughter of Jacob. So he was able to see her in the house of Potiphar. Well, come over here, honey. What does that say on your amulet? Oh my God, you're going to be my wife.
It would be his. It would be. I'm sorry. Osnat's mother was Dinah. Dinah would
And her
be
father was
Joseph's sister, be his half sister,
yeah,
right? Different mothers, same father. So
right.
Osnat becomes his niece, actually.
Yes. Well, great niece, right?
Great
Yeah.
niece. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
And then wait, there's the final Mashiach thing about it is in Baba Batra 122a, it says, in the time to come, the land will be divided in 13 tribes.
Ooh.
No one ever commented on it except Gellman. One idea, 13 tribes in an obscure little sugya there. And I'm saying 13 tribes, what?
Who's the 13th tribe?
Exactly. The 13th tribe is Dinah.
Is Dinah.
She deserves a tribe. She deserves a tribe because she was one of the children of Jacob, and she was a woman, and she wasn't counted, and women aren't counted, and in Mashiach's sight, men and women will be counted equally.
All right. Well, this is the secret of this Torah portion, and now you can tell all your friends that you know this secret. So thank you, Marc, for sharing the secret today. And thank you for the conversation about Jewish power. And to everyone, a very, very sweet end of the Hanukkah holiday. Have another latke. If they're left over, finish them because they're not good after Hanukkah. And another jelly donut.
5 minutes, they are good. You
have a wonderful, wonderful Shabbos and Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Hanukkah Sameach.